Next up, I would like to invite Clifton Cortez and Edmund, who will discuss the SOGI data revolution.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Clifton Cortez, and I'm the World Bank's advisor for sexual orientation and gender identity, and I'm invisible. But not just me, you're invisible. We're invisible. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, our folk are invisible. And this matters. We often are not invisible to each other. We may not be invisible in the communities in which we live, and even not invisible maybe to our families. But we're almost always invisible to government decision makers and policy makers, and that matters. And this is at the national, the regional, and the global level. So what makes us invisible? A lack of data about us and our lives. Data can provide the texture of who we are and how our lives are lived. And when it's not there, that texture is gone. It can ensure that we're counted and that we count. And our governments do this for all their citizens, most of their citizens, all the time, the counting folks, understanding their lives. Data can underpin our stories. It can add the color that we need to tell our stories, regardless of where we live, what community, what culture we're in. Now, the idea that data is critical is not my bright idea. This has underpinned our collective development efforts around the world for decades. And in fact, it underpins the new Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, still new, agreed by all member states in September 2015, and that we're supposed to achieve in 15 years, by 2030. So, what are the Sustainable Development Goals? I think most people know something about them, so I'm just going to remind us. There are 17 of them, and they cover most aspects of human development that we can think of, whether it's environment, or health, or education, or economic growth, poverty. It covers all those things. It covers aspects of all of our lives. And how are we going to know that we achieved it or not? They're going to be supporting research for generation of new data, collection of that data, and analysis of that data. Our governments are going to do that. They've committed to it. The resources are going to be committed to it. And that's where our problem comes in, our invisibility problem. And this is what we have to address. So our community remains invisible because there are plans in almost no country to include sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression in this data collection effort for the next 15 years. That's our collective challenge. So, the World Bank Group, whom I represent, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, whom Edmund represents, and I'm going to introduce him in a second, believe that it's important that our institutions provide some support to partners who want to address this and are going to work on this, whether it be governments, civil society organizations and activists, or other partners. And so, what will it take to address the data gap? Providing support to address that data gap. So as a first step, what we did, our two organizations, working with experts and other partners and civil society, importantly, produced Investing in a Research Revolution for LGBTI Inclusion. I don't have a lot of copies, but I'll have them in the back afterwards. Please pick it up, and you can always ask me for it or get it off the internet. And this document lays out what the data gaps are and what the strategic investments need to be. So the identified data gaps are estimates of the size of our populations, lesbians and gay men, and bi women and bi men, and transgender women, and intersex people. Measures of stigma, relationship between rights, inclusion, and economic growth, impact of laws, policies, and programs, linkages to prevailing gender norms, impact and prevalence of conversion therapies, and impact of migration or forced movement, especially refugees. And then we also identified research opportunities, national level surveys and representative individual or household surveys, macroeconomic modeling, mixed method research, utilization of other emerging innovative methods, and big data and data science. And finally, we identified the strategic investments to jumpstart the data revolution that we need for LGBTI inclusion. We need to invest in capacities and partnerships. We need to invest in research priorities identified by the LGBTI civil society groups. And importantly, we need to invest in the new UNDP-led LGBTI Inclusion Index. And my colleague and friend from UNDP, Edmund, is here to tell us about the index.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, ILGA. And thank all of you in the room, because your voices is what's making all this happen. Your voices, your experiences is critical to this, as Michael mentioned earlier. My name is Edmund. I'm with UNDP, the Asia Pacific Regional Center. I'm a policy advisor here and the lead for the LGBT partnerships in the region. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the LGBT Inclusion Index. Where did it come from? The LGBT Inclusion Index the concept started in 2015 when UNDP convened an expert group, a group of civil society, a group of academics, a group of private sector individuals to come together to answer two questions. Number one, how do we define LGBT inclusion in human development? And number two, based on the human development dimensions, which would be the highest priority for addressing the LGBTI development gaps? And this process was two steps. First, there was a convening of a multi-sectoral group of data measurement and SOGI experts representing civil society, academia, private sector, and multilaterals, and many of you actually are in this room today. The second step was actually led by ILGA and Outright International, two global NGOs with a huge reach, but also both of them have an ECOSOC status within the UN, and they led a validation process. One step of that was internet-based, and the second step was when over 100 NGO and LGBT community activists from every region of the world gathered into New York to endorse the findings and endorse the recommendations from the group that put this together. And what are they? What are the priority dimensions that was identified? And there are 5. The first one is, in no order of importance. The first one is political and civic participation. The second is economic well-being. The third is personal security and violence. The fourth is health, and then education. And so what are the next steps? In 2017, the World Bank Group and UNDP will co-lead a consultative process in 2017 intended to arrive at an agreement on indicators. And indicators are really critical because they will help inform the new research that can contribute to data, and that will ultimately populate this index and make the data useful for UN, for other stakeholders, for governments, and for civil society to effectively advocate for change and for safety and security of all of you. Thank you.
He was Edmund, and I'm Clifton Cortez with the World Bank. Together and with you, we can ensure LGBTI inclusion and development, and we can ensure that none of us remain invisible. So thank you very much.